Frank Holloway, a disabled veteran, woke up one morning to find his only wheelchair ramp being bulldozed by the very HOA he had paid dues to for 20 years, trapping him inside his own home. Leading the charge was Gordon Weaver, a power-hungry HOA president who saw rules not as guidelines, but as weapons to control and humiliate those he deemed unworthy. But what Weaver didn't expect was Frank's nephew, Ethan, who fought back with the full force of federal law, the media, and a lawsuit that would shake the entire HOA to its core. And let me tell you, the way this battle ended, it was nothing short of a brutal, well-deserved reckoning. The morning sun had barely climbed over the rooftops when the sickening crunch of wood snapping apart shattered the neighborhood's silence. Birds scattered in a panic, their wings flapping wildly as dust and splinters filled the air. Frank Holloway sat motionless in his wheelchair on the porch, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheels, his chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could do nothing but watch, helpless, as a bulldozer crushed his wheelchair ramp into a pile of shattered boards and twisted metal. It didn't feel real. He blinked, trying to force his brain to catch up, but the scene before him remained unchanged. His lifeline, the one thing that gave him the ability to leave his house, to have any semblance of independence, was being reduced to rubble. And the worst part? They were enjoying it. A cluster of HOA board members stood a few feet away, their faces unreadable except for one man, Gordon Weaver. The HOA president stood with his arms crossed over his chest, smirking like he had just won a game no one else was playing. His navy blue polo was perfectly pressed, his khakis untouched by the dust that swirled around them. An expensive gold watch glinted on his wrist, catching the sunlight as he turned slightly, addressing the small group of yes-men behind him. Non-compliant structures must be removed immediately, he declared, his voice calm, indifferent, as if reading a line from a damn instruction manual. Frank felt a slow, burning rage rise in his chest. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, his wheelchair feeling like a cage beneath him. His voice, though strained, was firm. "You never even responded to my request." Weaver turned his cold, calculating eyes on him, his expression unreadable. "If it wasn't approved," he said with a slow shrug, "it's illegal." Frank's jaw clenched. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Illegal. That's what they were calling it. The ramp that allowed him to leave his house, to get groceries, to exist beyond these four walls, was suddenly an illegal structure in the eyes of the HOA. For 20 years, he had lived in this neighborhood. 20 damn years. He had paid his dues, followed the HOA's ridiculous rules, endured their petty fines and pointless regulations. And this was what he got in return, a life sentence in his own home. The engine of a car roared into the driveway, brakes squealing as Ethan practically launched himself out of the driver's seat before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Frank's nephew was a broad-shouldered, no-nonsense kind of guy, and right now, he was pissed. He took in the scene immediately, the demolished ramp, the HOA board members, Frank sitting there, his shoulders slumped in humiliation, and his face darkened. He slammed the car door shut, marching toward the group, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" Weaver barely spared him a glance before sighing dramatically, as if he had been inconvenienced by the entire situation. "We had to enforce the bylaws," he said, tone dripping with condescension. "This ramp was an unauthorized structure." Before he could finish, Ethan was in his face, practically chest to chest, eyes burning with fury. "That structure was the only way my uncle could leave his house, you jackass." The board member shifted uncomfortably, but Weaver, he didn't even flinch. Then he should have gotten proper approval. That was it. Ethan's hands curled into fists, his muscles tensing with barely contained rage. He turned, looking at his uncle. Frank, who had once been a firefighter, a man who ran into burning buildings to save people, now trapped like a prisoner in his own home because of a bunch of self-important HOA goons. Frank's eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with humiliation. And that was the moment Ethan knew. This wasn't over. The remains of the wheelchair ramp still lay in a broken heap outside, pieces of splintered wood and mangled metal railings scattered across the front yard. It was as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to Frank's independence and left the evidence for him to stare at every time he looked out the window. Inside, the house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy. Frank sat in his wheelchair near the living room window, staring out at the gaping emptiness where his ramp had once been. His usually steady hands gripped the armrest tightly, his fingers twitching like they wanted to punch something, anything. Across from him, Ethan sat with his elbows on his knees, watching his uncle's face carefully. The old man had barely spoken since the HOA left. "How the hell am I supposed to get out of here now?" Frank muttered finally, his voice hoarse. He wasn't looking at Ethan, just out the window, past the wreckage, as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. Ethan swallowed. He didn't have an answer. What could he even say? The words "I'll fix this" felt empty when Frank was sitting there, trapped in his own damn home. "Maybe we can build another one," Ethan offered, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't that simple. The HOA had made their stance loud and clear. They would fight it at every step, and Frank didn't need another battle. Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. They'd just tear it down again. Ethan clenched his jaw. The worst part wasn't just that they had destroyed the ramp. It was that they had done on it in a way that made Frank feel weak. And if there was one thing Ethan knew, it was that his uncle had never been weak. Frank had spent decades running into burning buildings to save people. He had lost his legs in a rescue mission that went wrong, and even then, he had refused to be a victim. He had adapted, fought, built a life for himself. And now, a bunch of self-important HOA pricks had taken that away from him in a single afternoon. Not on my damn watch. Ethan shot up from his chair, pacing toward the kitchen with a storm brewing in his chest. He needed something, some kind of way to fight back. By the time the sun had set, the kitchen table was buried under printouts, legal documents, and HOA bylaws. He spent hours digging through every pointless rule the HOA had written, looking for anything that could justify what they had done, page after page of bureaucratic nonsense. But then he found it. A disability exception clause. It was right there, buried deep in the HOA's bylaws. Any resident requiring disability accommodations was legally permitted to make modifications to their home to accommodate their condition. Frank's ramp had been protected by law. The HOA had no authority to remove it. And the way that smug bastard Gordon Weaver had responded, the way he had shrugged, smirked, pretended Frank had broken the rules, they had known. The next morning, Ethan barely gave himself time to shower or eat. He was out the door before sunrise, his car tearing down the street toward the HOA office, a freshly printed copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, clutched in his hand. This time, they were going to listen. Ethan didn't bother checking in at the front desk when he stormed into the HOA office. He pushed right through the glass doors, ignoring the startled receptionist, and walked straight into the conference room where the HOA board was having their morning meeting. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to him, some startled, some annoyed. At the head of the table sat Gordon Weaver, his usual smug demeanor in full force as he sipped on his overpriced coffee. "Mr. Holloway," he sighed, barely looking up from his agenda. "I hope you're not here to cause a scene." Ethan didn't stop walking until he was standing directly in front of him. Then he slammed the printed documents onto the table, the sound snapping through the room like a gunshot. "You violated federal law," Ethan said, his voice cold and controlled. "That ramp was legally protected, and you knew it." A ripple of unease moved through the room. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward Weaver. For a moment, Weaver's mask slipped. There was a flash of recognition, a moment where Ethan could tell he knew exactly what Ethan was talking about. But then, just as quickly, the smug grin was back. Weaver leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together as if this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Well," he said smoothly, "if you'd like to file a complaint, you're welcome to take it up with our legal team." Ethan didn't even blink. His next words were like a hammer hitting stone. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." And for the first time, Weaver's smirk faltered. Ethan didn't sleep. Not really. His mind had been buzzing since the moment he walked out of the HOA office. Weaver's smug face burned into his memory like a permanent stain. The man had dismissed him, brushed off the ADA violation, like it was nothing more than an annoying technicality. But Ethan wasn't going to let this slide. He refused to let a bunch of HOA bureaucrats strip his uncle of his freedom without a fight. So he got to work. Within 24 hours, Ethan had made 3 calls, each one a ticking time bomb aimed straight at the heart of the HOA. 1. An AD attorney, someone who knew exactly how to tear apart organizations that thought they were above the law. 2. A local news station, because nothing made HOA boards sweat faster than bad press. 3. The Department of Justice's Disability Rights Division, because federal violations didn't just come with lawsuits, they came with consequences. By the next morning, his inbox was flooded with responses. The news station? They wanted an interview. The attorney? He was already drafting a cease and desist letter. The DOJ? They were very interested in what the HOA had done. Ethan smiled. It was time to turn the tables. By the end of the week, the HOA board members were scrambling. It started small, quiet meetings, hushed conversations in Weaver's office. Then, the panic spread. Emails were sent in frantic bursts. Phone calls were made in urgent whispers. And then, the news crew showed up. Ethan had made sure they got the best angle, right in front of Frank's house, where the destroyed wheelchair ramp still lay in a pathetic pile of splinters and twisted metal. Frank sat on his porch, his wheelchair positioned so the cameras could capture everything, the humiliation, the anger, the complete injustice of what had happened. And just like that, the world saw. The footage spread like wildfire. Veterans groups erupted in fury. Disability rights activists demanded action. Even a few state representatives weighed in, calling the HOA's actions a blatant violation of civil rights. And Weaver? For the first time, he looked nervous. A local reporter cornered Weaver outside the HOA office, shoving a microphone in his face as the camera zoomed in on his sweat-slicked forehead. Mr. Weaver, do you have a response to allegations that the HOA illegally removed a disabled resident's accessibility ramp? Weaver stumbled. His usual confidence wavered as he glanced around, as if looking for a way to escape. This is a misunderstanding, he stammered, tugging at his collar. Beads of sweat formed at his temple. We were simply following HOA guidelines, he tried to add, forcing a weak smile. The reporter didn't let up. So you're saying your HOA rules override federal law? Weaver opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. The camera caught every second of his failure, and within hours, the clip was everywhere. Blasted across social media, played on the evening news, shared by thousands. People were furious. Hundreds of comments flooded the news station's page. This is disgusting. That man is a veteran. He served his country and this is how he's treated? Someone better lose their job over this. HOA boards think they're God. Time for them to learn otherwise. And just when Ethan thought things couldn't get better, the Department of Justice announced an official investigation. The next morning, Ethan stood outside Weaver's office, leaning casually against the doorframe as the HOA president paced behind his desk, phone clutched in his hand, his face ashen. The moment he noticed Ethan, his eyes darkened. "What the hell do you want?" he snapped. Ethan smirked. "Oh, just checking in," he said smoothly. He pulled out his phone, flipping the screen toward Weaver. It was paused on a DOJ press release announcing a formal investigation into HOA discrimination practices. Weaver froze. Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it sting. "You wanted to enforce HOA rules?" he murmured, tilting his head. "Well, now you get to see what happens when someone enforces real laws." The color drained from Weaver's face, and for the first time since this all started, Ethan saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The fallout hit like a wrecking ball. It started with the lawsuit, a 6-figure legal sledgehammer that came down on the HOA with the full weight of the ADA behind it. Their legal team tried to push back at first, throwing around terms like procedural error and misinterpretation of policy. But the moment the Department of Justice got involved, their entire strategy crumbled. There was no defense. The evidence was overwhelming. Between the news coverage, the ADA violation, and the national outrage, there was nowhere to hide. The HOA's own bylaws contradicted their actions. They had knowingly and willfully destroyed an essential accessibility structure, trapping a disabled veteran inside his own home. And the courts did not take kindly to that. The ruling came down swift and merciless. The HOA was ordered to pay for a brand new, custom-built wheelchair ramp, not just a cheap replacement, but one designed to last, upgraded with weather-resistant materials and built to federal standards. And on top of that, a hefty financial settlement. Enough for Frank to cover any medical costs, home modifications, or even a well-deserved vacation. The best part? It all came straight from the HOA's pockets. Inside the HOA boardroom, panic spread like wildfire. Board members turned on each other, each one trying to escape the blame. Emails were leaked, revealing that multiple members knew about the disability clause, but went along with Weaver's plan anyway. The entire HOA was imploding. And Weaver was the first to go. Within a month, he was removed from his position, forced to resign in disgrace. The official HOA statement called it a regrettable misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. The community was furious. His reputation was in shreds. Homeowners, once afraid to speak out, revolted. People who had spent years quietly suffering under Weaver's authoritarian rule banded together, challenging every unreasonable fine, every ridiculous restriction he had forced on them. Without his iron grip, the HOA collapsed under its own weight. And the final nail in the coffin? The Department of Justice didn't stop at Frank's case. It turned out the HOA had a history of discriminatory enforcement, ignoring violations when it benefited board members, punishing homeowners they didn't like, and even blocking disability accommodations in other cases. Frank's ramp had been the spark. But now the entire house of cards was falling down. The last time Ethan saw Weaver, it was in a courtroom. He sat in the back of the room as the judge tore into Weaver, methodically breaking down every excuse, every pitiful attempt to shift blame. Weaver didn't argue. He barely even spoke. He just sat there, his face pale, his hands gripping the table, watching as his career, his power, his entire life crumbled in front of him. When the judge delivered the final ruling, permanent disqualification from holding any HOA leadership position, financial penalties, and mandatory compliance training, Weaver just nodded stiffly. There was no fight left in him. When the hearing ended, he walked out of the courthouse with his head down, avoiding the cameras that had gathered outside. Ethan stood near the exit, watching as the once smug, arrogant man pushed past reporters, mumbling no comment as microphones were shoved in his face. And in that moment, Ethan smiled. Justice served. Because this time, the rules had worked against the ones who thought they were untouchable.